David Carson had always preferred the silence of the forest over the noise of the world. A former military engineer, he had retreated to a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere to escape the pressures of life. He lived off the land, hunting for food and fixing old machines. It was peaceful. The only disturbances came from the occasional animal or the wind whispering through the trees. But today was different. It started with a low hum, a sound like thunder rolling across the sky. At first, David thought it was just another storm building, but then the hum grew louder, unnatural, almost mechanical. He stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the bright morning sun. That was when he saw it. A streak of light, burning through the sky like a falling star, was heading straight for the forest. The object was too big, too fast, and there was no way it could be natural. David's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his hunting rifle, his heart racing, and sprinted toward the crash site, knowing that something strange was unfolding right in front of him. The forest was dense, and the path wasn't easy. But David pushed on, guided by the bright light now flashing in the distance. As he got closer, he could feel the heat radiating off the wreckage. The ground shook as the ship collided with the earth, sending up a cloud of dirt and smoke. David approached cautiously, his rifle ready. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal. He could barely make out the shape of the ship, shattered and twisted, pieces of it scattered across the clearing. It was unlike any spacecraft David had ever seen. Its sleek, dark metallic surface shimmered in the daylight, reflecting the chaos of the crash. He moved closer, scanning the wreckage. The silence was deafening now that the crash had stopped. Only the crackling of flames could be heard. David's eyes searched the debris until they landed on something, or rather someone. A figure, barely visible through the smoke, lay motionless near the edge of the wreckage. Without thinking, David rushed over to her. It was a girl. She looked human, but something was off. Her skin had an odd, faint glow to it, and her long silver hair shimmered even in the dim light. She was breathing, but just barely. David's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt down beside her, checking for injuries. Her clothes were torn, but she had no obvious signs of broken bones. She had an almost otherworldly beauty, but that was the least of his concerns. He couldn't leave her there. She was alive, and David knew that if he didn't act fast, she wouldn't stay that way for long. David lifted her carefully, feeling the strange weight of her body. She was much lighter than he expected. He looked around for any signs of danger. The ship's destruction could attract attention, and the last thing he needed was trouble. But everything seemed quiet for now. He carried her back toward his cabin, his mind racing. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had her ship crashed on Earth? He didn't have answers, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary crash. This was something else entirely. Once inside his cabin, David laid her down on a cot. The place was simple, sparsely furnished, but it had everything he needed. He set to work, using his military training to stabilize her. He carefully cleaned the cuts and scrapes on her face and arms, noticing how her skin felt colder than human skin. There was a faint bluish hue to her veins that was unmistakably alien. He checked her pulse. Slow but steady. Her breathing was shallow, but she wasn't in immediate danger of dying. For now, that was enough. David stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow. His mind kept circling back to one question. Who was this girl? She wasn't from Earth, that much was obvious. The crash alone proved that. But why had she come here? And how had she survived such a catastrophic crash? He couldn't answer those questions yet, but he knew he had to keep her safe. He had always trusted his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he could imagine. As the night fell, David sat by the fire, watching over her. The only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the flames. The girl was unconscious, but he couldn't help but feel that her arrival here was no accident. His life had just changed forever, and there was no going back. David watched her closely as she lay on the cot, her chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the cabin, casting flickering shadows across the room. Her strange, silvery hair shimmered in the warm glow of the flames. She was still unconscious, but David could see she was beginning to stir. It had been hours since he had brought her inside. He had used his first aid kit to tend to her injuries, mostly cuts and bruises from the crash. Her skin was unlike anything he had ever seen. It seemed smoother than human skin, almost as though it were made of something more delicate. He wondered if it had been damaged by the crash, or if this was just the way she looked. There was so much about her that didn't make sense. David stepped closer, his curiosity growing stronger. What was she? Where had she come from? And most importantly, why had she crashed on Earth? There were so many questions, and no easy answers. He found himself staring at her face, wondering if she would wake up and reveal some truth that would explain everything. Suddenly, her eyes fluttered open. David took a step back, startled. Her eyes were a bright shade of violet, shimmering, almost glowing in the low light. She blinked a few times, as if trying to adjust to her surroundings. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just looked around the room, her gaze confused and distant. David cleared his throat, trying to be calm. "Hey, you're safe now," he said softly. His voice was steady, though he felt his heart racing. "You're in my cabin. You've been unconscious for a while, but you're going to be all right." The girl turned her head slowly, her eyes focusing on him. There was a strange sense of wonder in them, as if she was seeing him for the first time, almost like she was trying to understand him. David was struck by how beautiful she was, but there was something more than beauty. There was something otherworldly about her. She opened her mouth, but her voice came out soft, almost like a whisper. "Who are you?" David paused, unsure of how to answer. "I'm David. David Carson," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I found you after your ship crashed. I brought you here to help you." She blinked again, still processing his words. Then she lifted her hand slightly, as if reaching for something, but quickly pulled it back, confused by the weakness in her body. David noticed that she was trying to sit up, but her body seemed too tired to respond. "Don't try to move too much," David said quickly. "You've been through a lot. You need rest." The girl's violet eyes searched his face, and David could sense that she was trying to communicate something. She seemed to understand his words, but she had no idea what to say in return. It was clear that she wasn't from Earth. Her mannerisms, her speech, even the way she looked at him. Everything was different. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice growing a bit stronger. David took a breath, sitting down in a chair next to the cot. He had no idea how to explain things to her, especially with the language barrier. But he had to try. "You're on Earth, in a place called Montana," he said slowly. "This is a pretty remote part of the world. Not many people come out here." She seemed to process his words, but her eyes were still filled with confusion. It was obvious that she didn't understand much of what he was saying, but she was trying to communicate, trying to understand. David leaned forward, trying to make things clearer. "I found your ship. It crashed. I don't know where you came from or why you were here, but you're safe now. You don't have to worry about anything. I'll take care of you." She stared at him for a moment, and then she seemed to do something odd. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. Her gaze felt almost intense. It was like she was searching his face for answers that didn't exist. "Earth," she repeated, the word sounding strange on her tongue. David nodded. "Yes, Earth, my home." She blinked again and then looked away, gazing at the room around her, as if it were the first time she had ever seen such a place. Then her eyes returned to David, and for the first time, she seemed to focus on him with more clarity. It was as though she was seeing him, not just as a human, but as something familiar. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for saving me." David blinked, surprised by the softness in her tone. "It's nothing. You were hurt, and I couldn't leave you out there." But something in her eyes made him pause. There was a strange depth to them, something he couldn't quite place. He wasn't sure what it was, but as she lay there, staring at him, he couldn't help but feel like he had just stepped into something far bigger than he had imagined. And somewhere deep inside, a small, unexpected part of him felt a stirring. Was it gratitude or something else? David wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for sure. His life had already changed, and there was no turning back. David Carson had always felt more at home in the wilderness than in the bustling cities of the world. After leaving behind a career in the military, he sought peace in the remote forests of Montana. His cabin, tucked away deep in the trees, was his refuge from the world, a place where he could focus on his quiet life. He spent his days hunting, fixing old machines, and enjoying the solitude he had longed for. But today, everything was about to change. It began with a strange hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from the sky. David was used to the usual noises of the forest, the wind rustling through the leaves, the calls of birds, but this was different. This was something unnatural, something mechanical. At first, he thought it might be a plane or a distant storm, but then the noise grew louder, more intense, and David felt a shiver run down his spine. Curiosity pushed him to step outside his cabin and look up. What he saw stunned him. A bright streak of light flashed across the sky, cutting through the blue like a shooting star, but it was far too big. It wasn't just falling, it was crashing. David's heart raced. Whatever it was heading straight toward the forest. Without thinking, he grabbed his rifle, his instincts kicking in. As a former soldier, he had learned to deal with unexpected situations, but this was something entirely different. He wasn't sure what he was about to face, but he knew he had to find out. He ran through the trees, his breath heavy as he pushed through the underbrush. The ground beneath him shook slightly as the mysterious object got closer. There was no time to waste. The crash site was only a few miles away, but David's legs burned with every step as the sound of the crash grew louder, the hum becoming a deafening roar. Finally, he reached a clearing, and what he saw left him speechless. The object had crashed into the forest with a force that had splintered the trees around it. The wreckage was scattered, the remains of a ship smoldering and sending plumes of smoke into the sky. It was unlike anything David had ever seen. The ship was sleek, metallic, with smooth curves and a design that seemed almost otherworldly. The wreckage lay in twisted pieces, but David could see something, or someone, inside. His pulse quickened as he carefully made his way toward the wreck. He had no idea what to expect, but his training had taught him to remain cautious. He crept closer, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The smoke from the ship swirled around him, making it harder to see, but there, near the edge of the wreckage, he spotted a figure. A woman. She lay unconscious, her body limp and pale against the blackened earth. Her long, silver hair spread out around her like a halo, and her skin, though bruised, had an almost ethereal glow. David's heart raced as he approached, his eyes scanning for any sign of life. He knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was faint, but she was alive. He couldn't leave her here. His mind raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? And how had she ended up on Earth? David quickly made the decision. He couldn't waste time. The wreckage could attract attention, and he needed to get her to safety. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she was. Her body felt strange, almost fragile, and he noticed that her clothes were torn and burned in places. He hurried back to his cabin, moving as fast as he could through the thick woods. The girl's weight was light, but the urgency in his chest made her seem heavier with every step. The thought of leaving her behind never crossed his mind. She was in danger, and so was he, but the instinct to protect her was stronger than any fear he felt. Once inside his cabin, David laid her on his cot. The cabin was small, but it was all he needed. He grabbed his first aid kit and began tending to her injuries. He cleaned the cuts on her arms and face, noticing that her skin wasn't like anything he had ever seen before. It was smoother, almost iridescent, and there was a faint, soft glow to it, as if she were somehow connected to the stars. David tried to make sense of it all. How could a being like her have crashed here? And why? He had no answers. His mind was racing, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This wasn't just a rescue, it was something bigger. But he couldn't focus on that right now. Her life was in his hands. He sat beside her, watching her carefully as she lay unconscious. The fire in the corner of the cabin crackled softly, the only sound breaking the silence. David's thoughts were a jumble of questions, but there was one thing he knew for sure. His life was no longer just about the quiet, lonely days he had come to cherish. Something had changed. His world had shifted the moment he had found her, and he had no idea what would come next. The days passed slowly after David had brought the girl back to his cabin. Her name, as it turned out, was Zira. It took her several days to regain consciousness fully, but when she did, David was there, watching over her. Her eyes, a deep shade of violet, still held that same mysterious look, as if she was seeing the world for the first time. David continued to care for her, feeding her and making sure she rested. He had no idea what kind of dangers might be following her. There was always the nagging thought in his mind that whoever, or whatever, had caused her ship to crash might still be out there, searching for her. Zira, for her part, seemed to be regaining strength. Her speech was slow at first, but she began to communicate more clearly. Though there was a language barrier, David didn't mind. He had learned to be patient in his years living alone, and something about Zira made him want to help her even more. She was different, and yet there was something undeniably human about her too. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cabin, Zira finally spoke the words David had been waiting for. "We're not safe here," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "They're coming for me." David sat up straighter, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He had feared this moment would come. He had known, deep down, that the crash hadn't been an accident. There were forces at play, forces that would stop at nothing to find Zira and take her away. "Who's coming for you?" David asked, his voice firm. He needed answers, even if they were hard to hear. Zira looked out the window, her eyes distant as though she could already sense what was approaching. "The Empire," she said, her words heavy with fear. "I was part of a mission to stop them, but they discovered what I had, what I carry. They will do anything to get it back." David frowned, not understanding fully, but he could feel the weight of her words. Something about this empire sounded dangerous. "What do they want from you?" Zira turned to him, her expression filled with regret. "My blood, my genetic makeup. It holds the key to a weapon they've been trying to perfect for centuries. Without me, they cannot complete it." David took a deep breath. He couldn't fathom what she was talking about, but the urgency in her voice was enough to convince him that this was no ordinary situation. He needed to protect her. He couldn't let the Empire take her. Not after everything she had already been through. "We can't stay here," David said, standing up from his chair. "We need to move. We can't risk them finding you." Zira looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something else, something like hope. She didn't speak, but her gaze seemed to ask the question, "Where will we go?" David thought quickly. His cabin was far from any major town, hidden deep in the forest, but that wouldn't be enough. He couldn't stay in one place for too long. Whoever was after Zira would eventually find the wreckage of her ship, and that would lead them straight to him. He had a plan. Well, not a perfect one, but it was better than nothing. "I have a ship," David said, his voice steady. "It's not much, but it's enough to get us off the planet. We'll leave Earth. We'll go somewhere far from here." Zira's eyes widened. "A ship? You have a ship?" David nodded. It's old, but it works. I've been fixing it for years, just in case I needed to leave. It's not much, but it'll do." Zira's face softened, and for a moment, David saw a flash of relief in her eyes. She seemed to understand that leaving Earth was their best chance of survival. But there was also something else in her expression, a quiet sadness, as if leaving Earth meant leaving behind everything she had known. "What will happen if we leave?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Will they follow us?" David met her gaze and nodded grimly. "Yes, they'll follow. But we'll have a head start. As long as we stay ahead of them, we can find a safe place." Zira hesitated, but then she nodded slowly. She seemed to trust him. That trust was something David hadn't expected. He wasn't sure why she trusted him, a stranger, but he would do everything in his power to protect her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, David prepared the ship. It was an old, rusted vessel that had been hidden away in a nearby shed for years. He had kept it well maintained, always ready for a time like this. He didn't know where they would go, only that they needed to get out of Earth before it was too late. When everything was ready, he turned to Zira, who had come out of the cabin. She was standing by the trees, her eyes on the sky, as if she could already sense the danger approaching. "We're ready," David said quietly. Zira nodded, her face set with determination. "Let's go." With that, they set off into the night, leaving the familiar, quiet life David had once known behind, and stepping into an unknown future filled with danger and uncertainty. David and Zira stood side by side, staring at the old ship that would carry them far from Earth. The ship was small, its silver body worn from years of disuse, but it still held the promise of freedom. The air was cool and crisp as the last traces of daylight faded behind the trees. David's heart raced, knowing they couldn't afford to waste any more time. The Empire was coming. He could feel it in his bones. "Are you sure it will work?" Zira asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. David smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not much, but I've kept it in good shape. We'll be fine." He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was, he was nervous. He had never taken this ship on a long journey before. It had always been his backup, just in case something went wrong on Earth. But now, it was their only hope. Zira glanced at the ship, her expression unreadable. She had been through so much, and now she was putting her trust in David. He wasn't sure what drove her to do so, but he couldn't let her down. Not now. David made his way toward the cockpit, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. He climbed into the ship, settling into the pilot's seat. The console flickered to life as he pressed a few buttons, the old ship coming to life with a hum. It wasn't the smoothest of machines, but it worked. That's all that mattered. Zira stepped in beside him, her eyes still scanning the darkening sky. David couldn't help but notice the way her violet eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. They were captivating, filled with a depth he couldn't quite understand. He wanted to ask her more about herself, but now wasn't the time. "Ready?" David asked, glancing at Zira. She nodded, her expression serious. "Let's go." David activated the engines, and the ship slowly lifted off the ground, the forest below them growing smaller with each passing second. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, filled with stars that seemed to watch over them. It was beautiful, but David couldn't enjoy it. His mind was on the danger they were leaving behind, and the uncertainty of what awaited them. As the ship ascended, David kept his eyes on the control panel, carefully monitoring the ship's systems. Zira sat beside him, her hands resting on her lap, though she seemed ready to react at any moment. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and questions. David could feel her anxiety, even though she didn't say a word. Finally, Zira broke the silence. "David, do you think we'll be safe?" Her voice was quiet but filled with worry. David glanced at her, his grip tightening on the controls. "I don't know, but we have to try." The ship broke through the Earth's atmosphere, the blue and green of the planet shrinking away as they moved into space. David took a deep breath, the pressure of the unknown weighing on him. He couldn't afford to fail. Not for his own sake, but for Zira's. He could see the fear in her eyes, and he knew she was depending on him to keep her safe. "We're out of Earth's atmosphere," David said, his voice calmer than he felt. "We'll be far from their reach now, but we can't stop here. We need to keep moving." Zira turned her head, looking at him with those striking violet eyes. "Where will we go?" she asked. David didn't have an answer. He had no clear plan, but he couldn't think of that now. "I'll take us to the nearest colony I know. It's a remote place. No one should find us there." Zira nodded, though her expression was still troubled. She was quiet for a moment, and David could feel the weight of her unspoken thoughts. Finally, she spoke again. "David, thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." David was taken aback. He wasn't used to being thanked. In his line of work, saving people wasn't a job. It was instinct. He hadn't expected to hear gratitude from someone he had just met, and certainly not from someone like Zira. "You don't need to thank me," David said softly. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." But Zira didn't seem convinced. She turned to face him fully, her gaze more intense than before. "You saved me. I didn't ask for your help, but you didn't hesitate. You did what you had to, even though you didn't know who I was or what I meant." David shifted in his seat, his mind struggling to understand the weight of her words. It was true. He hadn't hesitated, but he hadn't expected to form a bond with her. In such a short time, Zira had become more than just a mission. She had become someone he needed to protect. They flew in silence for a long time after that, the ship hums providing a steady backdrop to the quiet tension in the cockpit. David kept his eyes on the stars, but his thoughts kept returning to Zira. There was a part of him that wanted to ask more questions about her life, her mission, the empire that chased her, but it wasn't the time. They had bigger concerns. They had to survive. And as they drifted further into the unknown, David couldn't help but feel the growing weight of responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. The danger wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. The silence in the cockpit stretched for what felt like hours as David and Zira journeyed deeper into space. The stars were a cold, distant sea outside the window, their light flickering like tiny diamonds against the dark canvas. David had flown through space before, but this time, it felt different. There was a weight on his shoulders, heavier than anything he had ever experienced. He was responsible for her now, for Zira. David glanced over at Zira, who sat quietly beside him, her violet eyes fixed on the stars outside. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers gently tracing the edges of her seat. David had noticed how her demeanor had changed since they left Earth. The fear in her eyes hadn't fully disappeared, but there was something else now. A quiet sadness, as if she was mourning something she had lost. "We'll get through this," David said, more to reassure himself than her. Zira didn't respond right away, but after a long pause, she turned her gaze toward him. "David, do you ever wonder what life would be like if things were different? If none of this had happened?" David sighed, his hands still gripping the controls. "Every day." His voice softened. "But that's not the world we're in. We have to keep moving forward." Zira nodded slowly, as though she understood. Her eyes were distant again, but this time, it seemed like she was trying to make peace with the past. David couldn't help but admire her strength. Despite everything she had been through, she was still fighting. He couldn't deny that he admired her in ways he didn't fully understand. Hours passed, the only sounds in the cockpit being the hum of the ship and the occasional beep from the control panel. David had plotted a course to a remote colony on the outskirts of known space. It was small and largely uncharted, and it was the perfect place to lay low, at least for a while. But as they neared the edge of the system, the quiet was shattered by a sudden alert on the ship's radar. David's heart skipped a beat as he quickly checked the readout. A ship. It wasn't supposed to be there. David had known the space around them was supposed to be clear. No major traffic, no military patrols. But this was different. The ship on the radar was big, far too big to be a civilian vessel, and it was closing in fast. David. Zira's voice was strained. She had seen the change in his face, and she knew something was wrong. What is it? David's mind raced as he studied the ship's trajectory. It was coming toward them, and from the looks of it, it wasn't friendly. It's them, he said, his voice grim. The Empire. They've found us. Zira's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. How? We were so careful. David's hands flew over the controls, pulling up evasive maneuvers. I don't know, but we need to move. Fast. Without waiting for a response, David punched the throttle, sending the ship into a sharp dive. The small vessel responded quickly, jolting as it swerved to the left, narrowly avoiding a direct hit from the Empire ship's sensors. The ship was close now, and David knew that if they didn't escape soon, they wouldn't have a chance. Hold on, David shouted as the ship jerked to the side again, narrowly missing a laser blast. The ship shook violently, and the lights flickered. Zira's grip tightened on the seat as she braced herself. She had been through so much already, but this felt different. It wasn't just the ship that was in danger now. It was their lives. David had to think quickly. The Empire's ship was too big and too powerful for him to outrun with his old ship, especially if it decided to fire its weapons. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. There's a planet nearby, David said, his voice low but determined. It's uninhabited, but it has a dense atmosphere. If we can get there, we might be able to shake them off. Zira nodded, her face pale but resolute. Do it. David didn't hesitate. He pulled the controls back, sending the ship into a sharp turn toward the nearby planet. The engines screamed in protest, but they held steady. David knew they only had one shot. If they didn't make it to the planet, the Empire's ship would catch up with them, and they wouldn't have anywhere to hide. The ship tore through the stars, the distant planet growing larger in the viewfinder. David's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed the ship's limits, the warning lights flashing as the engine temperature began to rise. The Empire ship was still close behind, its massive shape filling the view in the distance. We're almost there, David muttered, more to himself than to Zira. The planet was within range now, its surface covered in thick clouds and heavy storms. It would be hard to track them in the atmosphere, and that was their only hope. The ship entered the planet's atmosphere with a violent jolt. The heat from the friction made the air shimmer outside, but David kept his focus. He couldn't let up now. The Empire's ship would be forced to follow them in, but they couldn't stay up for long. He had to get them to the surface, where they would be hidden from view. With one last sharp turn, David aimed the ship toward a dense forest at the edge of the planet's largest continent. The ship broke through the clouds and descended into the trees, finally touching down with a rough thud. David exhaled, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the escape. They had made it, for now. Zira sat beside him, her face pale but relieved. We're safe, for now. David nodded, but the wariness never left his eyes. He knew they couldn't stay here long. The Empire would be searching for them. But for the moment, they had survived. The ship's engines fell silent as David and Zira sat in the dense forest on the unknown planet. The only sound was the steady drip of rain on the ship's hull. It had taken them a few moments to catch their breath. And even though the immediate danger had passed, the tension between them remained thick. They had escaped the Empire's ship, but how long would it take before they came searching again? David wiped his forehead, trying to shake off the exhaustion. He had never thought he would be running for his life, let alone with an alien girl he barely knew. Yet here they were, stranded on a strange planet, fighting for survival. I think we should wait here for a while, David said quietly, his voice full of determination. We need to stay out of sight until we can figure out what to do next. Zira nodded, Her eyes focused on the planet's dense forest outside. The trees were enormous, their trunks covered in thick moss, and the sky was hidden behind layers of thick clouds. It felt like a world untouched by civilization, a perfect place to hide. But even here, they weren't safe. The Empire's search would be relentless, and Zira's presence would lead them straight to David. "How long will it take before they find us?" Zira asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. David hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The truth was, he didn't know. The Empire had vast resources, and if they were serious about finding Zira, it could take days, even weeks. But they wouldn't give up, not unless they found her first. "I'm not sure," David admitted, "but I'll make sure we're ready. I won't let them take you." Zira gave him a small smile, her gratitude evident in the soft look she gave him. She had begun to trust him in a way that made David feel both proud and responsible. He had never expected to be someone's protector, but with Zira, it felt like something he had to do. The ship's interior was small, and as they sat in silence, David couldn't help but notice how close they were. There was an unspoken bond between them now, one that was hard to ignore. Despite the danger, despite the fear, they were in this together. They had no choice but to rely on each other. After a while, David stood up and moved toward the cockpit to check the systems again. The ship's landing had been rough, and though they were hidden for now, they needed to make sure everything was functioning properly. Zira followed him silently, her steps light and quiet. The ship had landed at the edge of a large forest, where the trees grew so tall that they blocked out most of the sky. The thick canopy kept them hidden from any possible aerial scans, and the storm that had started to fall was another perfect cover. But David couldn't relax. "Not yet. Is there anything you can do to hide our signal?" Zira asked, stepping closer as David worked. David looked over at her, startled by the question. She seemed to know more than he had originally realized. Perhaps her past, her mission, had taught her things he didn't know. But now, it was her turn to help him. "I'll try to scramble the ship's signal," David said, moving quickly to the control panel. "It won't be perfect, but it should buy us some time. If the Empire's ships are tracking us by signal, we might be able to keep them off our trail." Zira nodded, her eyes scanning the outside, always alert. "Good. Time is all we need." David worked for a few minutes, adjusting the controls and reprogramming the ship's communication systems to make it harder to track. It wasn't foolproof, but it was better than nothing. After a few moments, the screens flickered, showing a scrambled signal. "There," he said, standing back. "That should work." Zira glanced at the screen and gave a small, approving nod. "Good. We have to stay hidden. If they catch on, we'll have no chance." David agreed. As much as he wanted to believe that they had time to rest, he knew better. The Empire wasn't going to stop searching for her, and sooner or later, they would come looking for signs of her ship. For now, though, the storm outside was their ally. The thick rain made it difficult for anyone to track their exact location, and the trees provided the perfect cover. "We can't stay here forever," David said, turning to Zira. "But we can make it for a while. We need to find a place to hide, a settlement or something. Some place the Empire won't think to look." Zira's face was thoughtful, but she didn't immediately respond. David could see that she was weighing her options. The way her eyes moved as she considered every possibility made it clear that she was no stranger to danger, no stranger to thinking on her feet. "I've been to other colonies," Zira said after a while, "farther away from the Empire's reach. I can take us to one of them, but it's going to be a long journey." David raised an eyebrow. "How far?" Zira's gaze was steady, and though she had been through so much, her voice held a quiet strength. "Several light years, but the Empire hasn't been able to reach them yet. They think the colonies are too remote." David frowned but knew it was their best chance. "All right, we'll go there, but we'll need to move quickly." Zira nodded again, her expression serious. She was already preparing for the next phase of their journey, her mind already focused on survival. As the storm continued outside, the rain beating against the ship, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The Empire wouldn't give up, and each passing moment made their situation more dangerous. But as long as they had each other, they had hope. The storm outside had settled into a steady, rhythmic drizzle as David and Zira prepared for their next move. The ship was hidden in the dense forest, and the thick clouds above shielded them from any possible detection. For now, they were safe. But the weight of the looming danger still hung in the air. David sat at the control panel, his eyes scanning the data once again. He couldn't stop thinking about their next destination. Zira had mentioned the remote colony, a place far from the reach of the Empire. It seemed like their only chance, but the journey would be long, and every moment they spent waiting increased the chances of being found. Zira entered the cockpit quietly, her footsteps barely making a sound. Her eyes were focused, determined, but there was something softer in her expression now. She had started to trust him, and that trust seemed to strengthen with each passing day. "We're ready," Zira said, her voice calm yet steady. "I know it's not much, but the sooner we leave, the better." David looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. "Are you sure about this? It's going to be a long journey." Zira nodded. "I'm sure. We don't have any other choice." David took a deep breath. He had spent most of his life running from things, but now with Zira, he was facing something completely different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about doing what was right. Protecting her was no longer just a mission. It had become personal. "Okay," David said, nodding. "We'll leave now. Get ready." Zira stepped back and went to the small sleeping area they had set up in the rear of the ship. David could hear her moving around, gathering a few things, though he didn't ask what. He knew she was always prepared, always thinking ahead. It was one of the many things he admired about her. As he powered up the ship's engines and lifted off, David's mind was a whirlwind. The remote colony was far off, and it wasn't the kind of place that offered much in terms of safety. If they made it, they could disappear. But if they didn't, the Empire would have them, and that would be the end of everything. Zira returned to the cockpit and took a seat beside him. She didn't speak, but David could feel her presence, steady and calming. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound now, the steady beat of their hearts as they flew into the unknown. "We'll make it," Zira said after a long silence. "We have to." David glanced at her, offering a small smile. "I hope you're right." The ship sped through space, leaving behind the safety of the planet and the storm. The stars were clearer now, stretching out before them like endless roads. There was something peaceful about space when it wasn't filled with danger. In that moment, David allowed himself to imagine a future where they were free, where Zira could live without fear. But even as he thought that, a part of him knew it wasn't going to be that easy. They had escaped, but the Empire wouldn't stop hunting her. There was no escaping that reality. He glanced at the navigational map on the dashboard, his finger tracing the line that would take them to the colony. "I've been here before." Zira spoke up, her voice steady. "I know the people. They won't turn us away." David turned to her, curious. "What are they like?" Zira smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "They're just people, like you. Some have been hiding from the Empire for years. Others are just trying to survive, like everyone else. It's not perfect, but it's safe." David nodded. He didn't care what it was like. He cared that they would have a chance to live, to find peace. He wanted that for Zira, more than anything. They flew through the stars in silence, the journey long and slow. Every hour, every minute, stretched on forever. But even with the tension that lingered between them, there was a sense of calm. They were together, and that made all the difference. After a long time, the colony finally came into view, a small cluster of settlements on the surface of a distant moon. It was surrounded by a thin atmosphere, and the only signs of life were the few ships parked in the docking area. It looked quiet, isolated. David guided the ship down, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the place that could offer them a chance. The landing was smooth, and as the ship touched down, Zira stood and looked out the window at the colony. The rain had stopped, and the first light of dawn was beginning to break across the horizon. "This is it," Zira said, her voice soft but full of hope. "We're here." David turned to her, his heart racing for a different reason now. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. This was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. They had made it, and for the first time, David felt the weight of his responsibility lift, just a little. Zira smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, David, for everything." David met her gaze, his chest tightening with emotions he didn't have the words for. "We're in this together, Zira. Always." And for the first time since he had met her, David believed it.